Part 1. The First Mile of Hot Wind. The year 1873 had baked the New Mexico territory down to its bones, under a sky the color of faded denim. The land lay cracked and thirsty, a patient reptile awaiting a rain that never came. Dust, finer than flour, coated everything, muffling the world in a gritty, ochre haze. It was a land of sharp edges and vast, empty spaces, where the silence of the prairie was a physical weight, broken only by the keening of the wind or the distant, mournful cry of a steam locomotive. The town of Redemption was a testament to the railroad's violent birth. It wasn't a town so much as a wound in the landscape, a collection of raw lumber buildings and canvas tents clinging to the iron tracks that stretched east and west toward horizons shimmering with heat. The air smelled of hot metal, creosote, sweat, and the sour tang of cheap whiskey spilling from the doors of the Crow's Nest Saloon. Inside that saloon, noise was a currency, the clatter of poker chips, the discordant plinking of an untuned piano, the guttural laughter of men who had forgotten what softness felt like. Outside, there was only the sun and the silence. Silas Boone felt more at home in the silence. He guided his mule, Judas, through Redemption's single, chaotic street, his eyes narrowed against the glare. At 30-something, Silas wore the landscape on his face. His skin was leathered by the sun, and fine lines radiated from the corners of his eyes the color of a stormy sky, watchful and slow to reveal anything. A faint, silvery scar cut a path from his temple into his hairline, a memento from a time he'd walled off behind a barricade of quietude. The war had taught him many things, but the most enduring lesson was that peace was a fragile, precious thing, to be cultivated in isolation. His peace was a small sheep ranch carved out of the unforgiving terrain, a place defended by a rotting fence and a gate that hung crooked on a single hinge. His world had shrunk to the size of that struggling patch of land, and to the small, bright life of the boy he was raising there. He tied Judas to the hitching post outside the mercantile, the wood worn smooth by countless rains. The list was short, written in his mind: flour, salt, coffee, and a small bag of peppermint sticks for Tommy. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, wasting nothing, not even a glance. Yet he saw everything. He saw the new faces, drifters lured by the promise of silver in the nearby hills. He saw the weary faces of homesteaders, their hope eroding with every dry day. And he saw the hard, predatory faces of men like Vance Cutter. Cutter was leaning against a support beam of the saloon's porch, polishing a silver concho on his gun belt. He was Asa Crow's shadow, a man built of lean muscle and casual menace, where Crow, the saloon's owner, wielded influence with the money and whispers. Cutter enforced it with the Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip. Silas gave him a wide berth, a silent acknowledgement of the law that truly governed Redemption, the law of the gun. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of canvas, cured leather, and dried beans. He gathered his supplies, his movements methodical. As the proprietor weighed out the flour, a notice tacked to the wall caught Silas's eye. It was a fresh poster, the ink still dark. Wanted. Information leading to the return of my runaway wife. Eliza Hart, 18 years of age, has absconded with property belonging to her husband. A generous reward is offered for her safe return to my care. It was signed with a flourish, Asa Crow. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He knew Crow. He knew the man's appetites and his complete lack of scruple. He also knew that a girl of 18, designated as property, was in a kind of trouble that the territory's flimsy legal system couldn't touch. He paid for his goods, his face an unreadable mask, took the small bag of peppermints, and turned to leave. He wanted nothing to do with it. His only duty was to the broken gate and the boy waiting behind it. The westbound train arrived as he was loading the sacks onto Judas, disgorging a cloud of steam and a handful of passengers into the oppressive heat. Among them was a young woman who seemed to shrink into herself, trying to become invisible. She moved with a jerky, nervous energy, her head down, a worn leather satchel clutched to her chest as if it were a shield. This was Eliza Hart, though Silas did not know it yet. All he saw was a fawn in a wolf's den. Ellie felt the eyes on her the moment she stepped onto the platform. The stares of the men lounging on the boardwalk were like physical things, heavy and invasive. She kept her gaze fixed on the dusty toes of her boots, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her satchel. Inside that bag was her only hope, a ledger book filled with meticulous entries, detailing names, dates, and payments for silver ore that never passed through an assayer's office. And tucked within its pages, a hand-drawn map of a rich silver vein on land that didn't belong to Asa Crow. These papers were the reason for the farcical marriage contract she'd been forced to sign. A crude legal trap to make her his possession, his collateral. The documents were her curse, and potentially her salvation. Her plan was simple. Born of desperation, get to Santa Fe, find a federal marshal, a real one, and pray he was an honest man. But Santa Fe was a long way off, and redemption felt like the end of the world. She had a few dollars, just enough for a ticket on the next stagecoach, but it wouldn't leave until morning. She needed a place to stay the night, a place where she wouldn't be seen. Her eyes scanned the street, dismissing the saloon immediately. The hotel next to it looked little better. Then she saw the livery stable at the far end of town. It offered no comfort, but it offered shadows. With a deep breath, she started walking, forcing a steady pace, trying to look like she had a purpose. From his porch, Vance Cutter watched her go. He pushed himself off the post, a slow smile spreading across his thin lips. He hadn't recognized her at first, but the description Crow had given him was clear. The girl was younger than he'd pictured. This would be easy money. He sauntered back into the saloon. Silas saw the exchange. He saw Cutter's predatory smile and the way the girl flinched as another man called out to her. He saw the whole miserable story play out in a single, silent moment. He untied Judas's reins, his jaw tight. "It is not your concern," he told himself. "You have a boy to raise." He nudged the mule forward, away from the town, toward the vast, indifferent prairie that stretched out before him. The broken gate awaited. The ride back to his ranch was a study in beige and brown. The sun hammered down, bleaching the color from the sky. The only life was the hardy scrub and the occasional lizard darting between rocks. But as he drew closer to home, the landscape began to change. Subtly at first, a lone, resilient cottonwood marked the turnoff to his property, its leaves rustling with a sound like running water. The fence was just as he'd left it, leaning and tired. The gate, secured with a loop of rope, protested with a groan as he opened it. But beyond it was his sanctuary. A small, sturdy adobe house stood sentinel, its walls thick against the heat. A windmill turned lazily, pumping a thin but steady stream of water into a trough for the sheep. The flock, a hardy churro breed, grazed peacefully in a nearby pasture, watched over by a familiar, stooped figure. Raul Ortega straightened up as Silas approached, touching the brim of his sweat-stained hat. The old man's face was a map of his 70 years, each line a story of drought, hardship, and survival. He had been on this land before Silas, before the railroad, before the territory even had a name. He understood the rhythms of the earth and the language of the sheep in a way Silas never would. "The wind shifts. Patron," Raul said, his voice raspy. "Smells of dust, not rain." "It always does," Silas replied, swinging down from the mule. "Everything all right here?" "The boy. He has been watching the horizon for you all afternoon." As if summoned, the screen door of the house creaked open and a small boy with a shock of blonde hair came running out. "Silas, you're back." Tommy launched himself at Silas's legs, hugging them tight. Silas rested a hand on the boy's head, a rare, gentle smile touching his lips. He had found Tommy 2 years ago, abandoned at a mission down south, a silent, hollow-eyed child, Now, the boy's laughter was the most common sound in the quiet house. "Did you bring him?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide. Silas reached into his saddlebag and produced the small paper sack. "Only if you finished your chores." Tommy's face fell for a second, then brightened. "I did. I filled the wood box and gave water to the chickens. Raoul saw me." Raoul nodded solemnly. "It is true. He is a good worker. This one." Silas handed the boy the candy. In that simple exchange, the tension from the town began to drain out of him. This was his world. This was all that mattered. He unsaddled Judas and led him to the corral, his movements sure and familiar. Later, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Silas sat on his porch, cleaning his rifle, a habit from the war he couldn't shake. The air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Tommy sat on the steps below him, carefully sucking on a peppermint stick, while Raoul smoked a thin cigar, the smoke curling into the dusk. It was peaceful. But the image of the girl, Ellie, intruded. He saw her frightened eyes, the way she clutched that satchel. He saw Cutter's smile. He thought of the poster signed by Asa Crow. A man didn't offer a generous reward for a wife he cherished. He offered it for a piece of property he needed back. He finished with the rifle and took it inside. The house was sparse, furnished with practical, handmade items. On a small table by his cot was a wooden box. He rarely opened it. Tonight, he did. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was a Colt Dragoon revolver, heavy and cold. Beneath it lay a single, faded Ambro-type photograph of a young woman with serious eyes and a gentle mouth. He stared at it for a long moment, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He had made a promise to that woman, and to himself. After the war, he would not seek out violence. He would build, not destroy. He closed the box, the click of the latch loud in the stillness. But he couldn't close the door on the unease that had followed him home from redemption. The rotting fence and the broken gate no longer seemed like charming imperfections. They felt like a warning. His small, quiet world was more fragile than he knew, and the hot wind blowing in from the east carried the scent of trouble he could no longer afford to ignore. Part 2. May I slip under your coat? The decision to leave his ranch, even for a day, had sat like a stone in Silas's gut. But the axle on his wagon was cracked, a repair needing a blacksmith's forge. And there were legal papers in Santa Fe concerning his deed that couldn't wait. The railroad was the fastest way. He'd left Tommy in Raoul's capable hands with a firm promise to be back by the next evening, and had ridden Judas to a small whistle stop east of Redemption to avoid the town's prying eyes. He hadn't expected to see her again. But there she was, huddled at the far end of the open-air flat car he'd chosen for its anonymity. It was the last car, carrying nothing but steel rails and a few empty barrels, buffeted by the full force of the wind. She had made it out of Redemption, but her relief was clearly short-lived. Every clatter of the wheels on the track made her jump, and she scanned the passing landscape not with wonder, but with the hunted gaze of a fox listening for the hounds. So, Silas kept to his side of the car, his hat pulled low. He was a man who respected boundaries, both physical and personal. Yet he found himself watching her. He watched as the relentless sun beat down, stealing the moisture from the air. He watched as the grit kicked up by the train settled in the folds of her dress and on her pale, exhausted face. She had pulled her hair back, but strands had escaped, whipping across her cheeks like tiny lashes. She clutched her leather satchel to her chest as if it contained her own heart, a fragile thing to be protected from the harshness of the world. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. The heat of the day bled quickly from the desert floor, and the air grew teeth. A cold, sharp wind swept across the plains, cutting through Ellie's thin cotton dress. A shiver racked her body, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She wrapped her arms around herself. But it was no use. The cold was deep, a cold born of fear and fatigue as much as the dropping temperature. Her eyes drifted to the silent man on the other side of the car. He sat with his back against a stack of rails, seemingly immune to the elements. His long duster coat, the color of the dust itself, was a fortress of canvas and wool. He looked solid, immovable, a piece of the very landscape they were traveling through. He hadn't spoken a word to her, had barely acknowledged her presence, but he hadn't stared with the greedy eyes of the men in town, either. Pride warred with desperation, and desperation won. She couldn't stop shaking. Unsteadily, she rose and picked her way across the rocking car, her hand brushing against a cold steel rail for balance. She stopped a few feet from him, a waif silhouetted against the dying light. He looked up, his gray eyes unreadable. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, almost carried away by the wind. "Sir." Silas simply watched her, waiting. "Sir," she repeated, her teeth chattering. May I slip under your coat?" The request hung in the air between them, stark and vulnerable. It was a plea of such simple, desperate need that it bypassed all of Silas's carefully constructed walls. He saw not a woman, but a chilled, frightened child. He thought of Tommy, sleeping soundly and safely in his bed back home. For half a heartbeat, he hesitated, the old instinct for self-preservation screaming at him to stay uninvolved. Trouble was a contagion, and this girl was riddled with it. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Without a word, he shifted his weight and lifted the right flap of his heavy coat. It was an invitation, a small, protected space carved out of the vast, cold world. Ellie moved into the shelter he offered, sinking down beside him, her back against the rails. She was careful not to press against him, leaving a sliver of space between them. But the moment the heavy fabric fell over her shoulders, a profound warmth enveloped her. It was the warmth of the wool lining, of his own body heat, a dry and steady comfort that smelled faintly of sagebrush, leather, and dust. The violent shivering subsided into a gentle tremor. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. For the first time in days, a sliver of safety, however temporary, felt real. Silas stared straight ahead, his jaw set, acutely aware of the slight frame tucked beside him. He could feel the faint vibration of her breathing. He had crossed a line by offering this small comfort. He had tied his path to hers, if only for a few more miles. But the miles were running out faster than he thought. His gaze wasn't fixed on the sunset. It was scanning the low mesas and distant bluffs that flanked the tracks. He'd seen them 10 minutes ago, 3 riders, keeping pace with the train, just far enough away to be indistinct specks. They weren't cowboys or prospectors. They rode with the relentless purpose of hunters tracking their quarry. Cutter's men. They would be waiting at the next water stop, Santo Domingo Pueblo, and the train was already starting to slow. He looked down at the girl. Her eyes were closed, her face smoothed by a fragile moment of peace. Waking her back up to fear felt like a cruelty, but letting her ride into the trap would be a greater one. His decision was not made with thought, but with an instinct that came from a darker, more violent time in his life. He reached out and his hand closed gently but firmly around her arm. Her eyes snapped open, wide with alarm. Before she could speak, he put a finger to his lips. And what he did next didn't just steal her breath. It stole the world from under her feet. He moved with a sudden, shocking speed. He grabbed a loose iron spike from the floor of the car. In 3 brutal, clanging strikes, he smashed the coupling pin that connected their flat car to the rest of the train. The shriek of tortured metal was drowned out by the locomotive's whistle. The gap between the cars widened. They were adrift, their momentum slowly dying. "What are you?" Ellie began, her voice a gasp of pure shock. "No time," Silas grunted. He pulled her to her feet, his grip like iron. "When I say jump, you jump. To the right. Try to roll." The main part of the train chugged onward, disappearing around a bend. Their own car was slowing rapidly, scraping and groaning. In the distance, the three riders had stopped, momentarily confused. "Now," Silas commanded. He didn't give her a choice. He pulled her with him, leaping from the edge of the car. The landing was a jarring shock of rock and gravel. The breath punched out of Ellie's lungs as she hit the ground, tumbling in a heap of tangled limbs and scraped skin. Silas landed with more control, absorbing the impact and rolling to his feet. He hauled her up, grabbing her satchel from the dirt. "This way, stay low," he ordered, his voice flat and urgent. He led her away from the tracks, not running, but moving at a swift, ground-eating pace into a labyrinth of arroyos and rock formations. Ellie's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Her knees were scraped raw, her ankle throbbed, but the adrenaline and the firm grip on her arm propelled her forward. This silent, brooding man had suddenly transformed into someone else entirely, a man of decisive, violent action. He found a deep, dry wash, its walls high enough to hide them, and pushed her down behind a cluster of boulders. He peered over the top for a long moment. "They'll check the car first," he said, more to himself than to her. "Then they'll look for tracks." He scanned the area, his eyes missing nothing. He pointed to a thicket of dry sagebrush. "Wait here. Don't move. Don't make a sound." He left her, moving with a silent grace that was unnerving. He gathered a small pile of the driest brush and, using a flint and steel from his pocket, sparked it to life. A thick, pungent cloud of white smoke billowed up, carried by the wind back toward the railroad tracks, obscuring the ground, a false trail. When he returned, he was all business. "We move now, while the smoke gives us cover." They spent the next hour navigating the treacherous terrain under his expert guidance, always keeping to the rocky ground where they would leave no tracks. The last of the light faded, and a blanket of stars, cold and impossibly bright, was thrown across the sky. Finally, he led her to a small, hidden cave carved into the side of a mesa, a natural shelter from the wind. He let go of her arm. The silence that fell between them was heavy with unspoken questions. Ellie sank to the sandy floor, her body finally surrendering to its aches and exhaustion. She looked at him, a silhouette against the starlit opening of the cave. "Who are you?" she finally whispered. He ignored the question. Instead, he asked one of his own, his voice low and serious. "That satchel. Crow wants it more than he wants you. Why?" Ellie hesitated. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. "I just saved you from 3 men who would not have been gentle," Silas said, his voice cutting through the dark. "I have earned the truth. What's in the bag?" She saw the logic in his words. He had risked himself for her, a stranger. She owed him this. With trembling fingers, she opened the satchel and pulled out the worn ledger. She handed it to him. Silas took it, striking another match. In the brief, flickering light, he opened the book, his brow furrowed as he looked at the columns of names and figures. He wasn't an educated man, but he understood the language of business, legal and otherwise. These were records of silver shipments, far too large for Crow's one legitimate claim. Then his thumb brushed against an embossed seal on the corner of an inner page. It was the crest of a well-known Santa Fe banking syndicate, an official mark that gave the contents a weight of undeniable, legal truth. He also saw the map, sketched with a knowledgeable hand, showing a vein of silver running straight through the land owned by the Acoma Pueblo. The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it with a hiss. He now understood everything. This wasn't a runaway wife. This was a witness holding evidence that could dismantle Crow's entire criminal enterprise. He stood up and walked to the mouth of the cave, looking out into the vast, dark emptiness of the territory. His peace was gone, shattered as surely as the coupling pin on the train. He had 2 choices. He could walk away now, leaving the girl and her dangerous secrets in this cave, and try to reclaim the quiet life he had built. Or he could see this through. He could accept that the war he'd tried to leave behind had found him again, in a different form. He thought of the broken gate on his ranch. He'd been meaning to fix it for a year. He'd always told himself he had time. He realized now that he didn't. You either fixed your fences, or the wolves got in. He turned back to face her. "My name is Silas Boone," he said, his voice resonating in the small space. "My ranch is a half-day's walk from here. We'll leave before dawn." They arrived as the sun was setting the next day, casting long shadows across the land. Ellie was so tired she could barely stand, but as they crested a small rise, she saw it a small adobe house, a windmill, a flock of sheep. It was a small pocket of order in a world of chaos. A young boy came running out the door, followed by a stooped, elderly man whose eyes were sharp and wary. The boy, Tommy, stopped short when he saw Ellie, his curiosity warring with shyness. Raul Ortega simply watched them approach, his gaze lingering on the girl, then moving to Silas's face, an unspoken question in his eyes. They had just gotten Ellie settled with a dipper of cool water when the sound of hoofbeats reached them. A lone rider approached, sitting tall in the saddle. It was a woman, wearing a tin star on her vest. Sheriff Maeve Hollis reined in her horse, her eyes taking in the scene. Silas, looking more grim than usual, the exhausted, dirt-streaked girl he was with, the tension that hung in the air. "Boone," she said, her voice practical and devoid of pleasantries. "Saw Vance Cutter and two of his cronies riding hard near the Santo Domingo wash. Looked like they'd lost something. You know anything about that?" Silas met her gaze, his face giving nothing away. "Just getting in myself. Sheriff?" Sheriff Hollis looked from Silas to Ellie, then back again. She was smart enough to know a lie when she heard one, and smart enough to know when not to push. "Well," she said, turning her horse, "Crow's getting bolder. Tell your guest to be careful." She tipped her hat and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a fragile, unspoken understanding in her wake. The law had come and gone, offering not a solution, but a warning. Silas looked at Ellie, then at the sturdy walls of his home. He had invited the storm inside. Now he would have to find a way to survive it. Part 3. A porch made of a coat flap. The first morning at the ranch, Ellie woke to a silence that was more profound than any she had ever known. It wasn't the absence of a noise. It was the presence of something else, the gentle lowing of sheep, the creak of the windmill, the whisper of a dry wind through the eaves. It was the sound of a world that moved at the pace of the sun, not the frantic, clattering rhythm of a locomotive. Her body ached from the jump and the long walk, a deep-seated soreness that served as a brutal reminder of her flight. But for the first time in weeks, she had woken up without the immediate, heart-pounding fear of discovery. Life on the ranch was a quiet, demanding rhythm. And Silas made it clear from the first day that shelter was not given for free. It had to be earned. He didn't say it with words, but with a simple gesture, holding out a milking pail as she emerged from the house, her eyes still clouded with sleep. Her first attempt at milking a ewe was a clumsy disaster. The sheep, unimpressed with her city-soft hands, kicked over the pail twice. Ellie's frustration mounted, hot and sharp, bringing tears to her eyes. Raul, who had been watching from a distance with his arms crossed, finally ambled over. He didn't mock her. He simply took her hands in his own, his skin like old parchment, and repositioned them, his touch firm and surprisingly gentle. "Patience, Nina," he rasped. "The sheep knows you are in a hurry. You must learn her song." She didn't learn the sheep song that day, but she learned something about patience. She learned the burn of her muscles as she hauled buckets of water from the well, the sharp smell of hay in the barn, the way the setting sun set the dust motes dancing in the air. Each chore was a step away from the terrified girl on the train. She was no longer just Eliza Hart. the runaway property of Asa Crow. Here, she was the person who collected the eggs, who kneaded the tough dough for their daily bread, who scrubbed the dirt from Tommy's knees after he took a tumble. The men communicated in a language of gestures. A glass of cool water would appear on the porch rail where Silas was working, and later, the broken handle of a tool Ellie was using would be found expertly wrapped in new leather. When a dust storm brewed on the horizon, a swirling wall of brown. It was Silas who strode around the small house, checking the shutters and silently tying a rope to the rattling kitchen window to secure it. They were small acts, as quiet and essential as the water the windmill drew from the earth. They were the mortar holding their fragile sanctuary together. Tommy, starved for any presence softer than Silas's quiet stoicism, attached himself to her. He showed her his secret collection of smooth river stones and taught her the proper way to whistle through a blade of grass. His simple, unquestioning acceptance was a balm. In his eyes, she wasn't a fugitive. She was just Ellie, the one who could tell a story about a faraway city with buildings so tall they scraped the clouds. Slowly, her posture began to change. The frightened stoop of a hunted animal gave way to a straighter spine. The constant, furtive glances over her shoulder became less frequent. One afternoon, Silas found her standing by the corral, staring out at the vast, empty expanse of the territory. "You can't spend your whole life looking at the horizon, waiting for what's coming over it," he said, his voice startling her. He was holding his old Winchester rifle. "Sometimes, you have to be what's waiting for it." He took her to a secluded arroyo a mile from the house. The rifle was heavy, the wood smooth and dark with age. Its purpose was unambiguous and terrifying. "I don't know how to," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll teach you," he said simply. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe out slow before squeezing the trigger. "Not pulling it. This isn't for hunting," he explained, his tone serious. "This is so you never have to hide under a man's coat again unless you choose to. It's for standing on your own feet." The first shot slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder, a brutal, jarring kick that made her cry out. Her ears rang, and the smell of gunpowder was acrid in the air. The tin can he'd set on a rock 50 yards away was untouched, but she set her jaw, reloaded, and tried again, and again. By the time the sun was low, her shoulder was a tapestry of purple and blue, but the tin can was riddled with holes. As they walked back to the house in the fading light, Silas gave her a short, approving nod. It felt more valuable than a pouch of gold. The quiet of the ranch was a deceptive thing. It gave a man too much time to think. One evening, as Silas watched Tommy chase fireflies near the porch, a different chase played out in his memory. It was always the same, the deafening roar of a cannonade at Shiloh, the air thick with smoke and fear. He saw the face of a young corporal named David, a boy from Ohio who'd shared his hardtack. He saw the advance, the chaos, the moment of hesitation on his own part, a split second of tactical doubt, a delayed order. A second was all it took. A flash of a rebel bayonet, a look of surprise on David's face, a life extinguished because he had been a moment too slow. That memory had forged the man he was now. It was the reason for his extreme, measured calm, and for the lightning-fast decisiveness that had made him jump from the train. He had learned in the cruelest way that hesitation was a luxury he could no longer afford. When he saw Tommy stumble near the edge of the porch, Silas moved in a blur, catching the boy by the shirt before he could fall. For a second, Ellie saw a flicker of raw panic in his eyes, a terror that was far greater than the situation warranted. Then it was gone, replaced by the usual stoic mask, but she had seen it. She had seen the ghost that haunted him. Their isolation was both a blessing and a curse. The drought worsened, the earth growing harder, the grass in the pastures turning a brittle yellow. The sheep grew thinner. It was a slow, creeping threat, a constant pressure that mirrored the human one they faced. One evening, As the three of them sat at the rough-hewn table, Silas made a decision. He laid Ellie's ledger before Raoul, the old man, who had treated the book as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Finally picked it up. He lit a candle, the flame dancing in his dark, wrinkled eyes. He didn't read the words or the numbers. His gnarled finger traced the symbols and stamps made in the margins. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up, first at Silas, then at Ellie. "Marcus del Diablo," he whispered. "The devil's marks. When I was a young man, before the railroad, there were men who came looking for silver. They had their own laws, their own marks for shipments that the government never saw. This is one of them." He pointed a trembling finger at a small, triangular stamp. "It means the ore is from sacred land, stolen." He closed the book gently. "This paper does not speak of money, patron. It speaks of blood. It is true, all of it." The confirmation settled in the room, heavy as a shroud. It was real. The danger was real. The next day, Silas knew he had to risk a trip into redemption for salt licks and grain, anything to help the flock survive. Ellie was seized with a cold dread. "Let me come," she pleaded. "I can hide in the wagon." "No," he said, his voice final. "You are safer here. The best way to hide is to stay hidden." He was gone for the entire day. Ellie spent it on edge, the rifle never far from her hand, watching the horizon. When his wagon finally appeared in a cloud of dust at twilight, the relief was so overwhelming it made her dizzy. But one look at his face told her that something had changed. "Cutter was in the saloon," he said, his voice low as he unhitched the mule. He was talking loud, asking folks if they'd seen a stray girl, and Asa Crow was asking the mercantile owner who'd been buying flour and coffee for 3. He looked at Ellie. "This place, our quiet is getting loud." The fragility of their sanctuary had never been more apparent. The next afternoon, while walking the fence line to check for breaks, Ellie noticed a splash of defiant color against the dull brown earth. A single, stubborn yellow wildflower, thriving on nothing but grit and sun. It was a small miracle, a promise that life could persist against all odds. She picked it carefully and carried it back to the house. That evening, she saw Silas's small, leather-bound notebook lying on the table where he kept track of his expenses, lambing dates, and rainfall. When no one was looking, she opened it and slipped the small yellow flower between 2 pages, a secret message of hope, pressed into the heart of his Spartan life. Later that week, she watched as Silas took a new plank of wood and a length of baling wire to the broken front gate. He didn't replace it, but he carefully splinted the broken hinge, wiring it tightly together until the gate could open and close without sagging. It was a temporary fix, a patch on a wound. "It'll hold," he said to her, though she hadn't asked. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "It'll hold until this storm passes. Then I'll build a new one, a proper one." He wasn't just talking about the gate. Ellie understood. He was making a promise. In a world of uncertainty, he was offering a future. It was a future that was still a distant hope, threatened by drought and shadowed by the guns of wicked men. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it might exist, standing there, with the mended gate between them. She finally felt her own feet solid on the ground. She was no longer hiding under his coat. She was standing in the shelter of a home he was trying to build around them both. Part 4, Dry Fire and Gunsmoke. The drought tightened its grip, wringing the last drops of moisture from the land until the very air seemed brittle enough to crack. The sun was a malevolent eye in a bleached white sky, and the prairie grass cured to the color of old bone, rustling with a dry, whispering sound that spoke of fire. It was a nervous, watchful time. Raoul found a stranger's boot print near the well one morning, too narrow to be Silas's, too new to be old. Another day. Silas discovered a half-smoked cheroot discarded near the northern fence line, a brand he knew was favored by the men who frequented Crow's Nest's saloon. The quiet was over. They were being watched. The threat did not announce itself with the thunder of hooves or the roar of a shotgun. It came in the dead of night, as a flicker of orange against the horizon, a malevolent dawn rising in the south where no dawn should be. Raoul was the first to smell it, a sharp, acrid scent on the wind that was more than just sagebrush. "Humo," he croaked, shaking Silas awake. "Smoke!" Silas was on his feet in an instant. Outside, the southern pasture was bathed in an unholy, dancing light. A line of fire, perhaps 100 yards long, was eating its way through the tinder dry grass, driven toward the ranch by a steady night wind. "Accident or intention, the result is the same," Silas said, his voice a low growl of controlled urgency. He was already pulling on his boots. "Raoul, get the sheep moving to the north paddock. Soak every sack and blanket we have. Ellie, fill the buckets. Every last one." There was no panic, only the grim efficiency of people facing a primal enemy. The night air, which should have been cool, was already growing hot, carrying with it the hungry roar of the fire. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, but the discipline of the past weeks took over. She worked the pump handle with a frantic, steady rhythm, her muscles screaming as she filled pail after pail, the splashing water a pathetic defense against the inferno. They fought the fire on the edge of the world. 3 small figures silhouetted against a wall of flame. The heat was a physical blow, sucking the air from their lungs. Smoke, thick and greasy, clawed at their throats and burned their eyes until tears streamed down their soot-blackened faces. They beat at the edges of the fire with the wet burlap sacks. The heavy thwump, 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 a desperate drumbeat against the fire's roar. Silas was a man transformed. He moved with a focused, ferocious energy, his face a grim mask of determination. He seemed to know what the fire would do before it did. Shouting orders over the din. "The wind is shifting to the east, cut it off by the gully." Ellie worked beside him, her initial terror burning away into a single, dogged purpose put it out. She swung the heavy wet sack until her arms felt like lead and her shoulders screamed in protest. Cinders landed on her arms, leaving small, angry burns. The smoke was a constant torment, but she didn't stop. She looked over and saw Raoul, his old body moving with a surprising stamina, his face set like granite. They were a line, a fragile, human firebreak against the encroaching chaos. The wind was their true enemy. For one terrifying hour, it drove the flames relentlessly toward the barn, where the winter feed was stored. Sparks rained down, and the dry shingles of the roof began to smolder. While Silas and Raoul fought the main line, Ellie scrambled onto the corral fence, pitching buckets of water onto the smoking roof. The sizzle of steam a small, temporary victory. Just when her strength gave out, when she felt she couldn't lift another bucket, the wind shifted again, turning back on the fire, pushing the flames into the blackened, burnt-out land they had already consumed, starved of fuel. The roaring beast began to shrink, its fury diminishing to a sullen, creeping glow. They didn't stop until the dawn broke, a pale, smoky light that revealed the devastation. A wide, black scar was burned across the southern pasture. The air was thick with the stench of ash. Exhausted, they collapsed near the water trough, their faces and clothes black, their bodies trembling with fatigue. In the gray light, Silas walked the edge of the burn. He stopped and bent down, picking something up. It was the shattered remains of a glass lantern, the metal base still smelling faintly of kerosene. "It was no accident," he said, his voice flat and cold. His gray eyes scanned the bluffs that overlooked his property, as if summoned by his gaze. 2 riders appeared on the nearest ridge. They were too far away to see their faces, but their silhouettes were sharp against the morning sky. They didn't move or wave. They just sat on their horses, watching. A clear, unmistakable message. We can touch you whenever we want. It was Vance Cutter's men, a quiet assertion of dominance. A knot of guilt, sharp and painful, twisted in Ellie's stomach, this black scar on the land, the fear that had hollowed Tommy's eyes as he watched from the window, the utter exhaustion on Raoul's old face. It was all her fault. She had brought this plague upon them. "Silas, she began, her voice choked with smoke and shame. "I should leave. I've brought you nothing but—" "Quiet," he cut her off, his eyes still fixed on the riders. "Running is what they want you to do." The standoff was broken by a third rider approaching from the east. It was Sheriff Maeve Hollis, her horse moving at a steady, unhurried pace. She didn't draw her weapon, but her presence was a tangible thing. She reined in, her gaze moving from the burned field to the men on the ridge, then to Silas. The riders watched her for another moment. Then, as if coming to a silent agreement, they turned their horses and disappeared over the ridge. "Looks like you had a busy night," Hollis said, her tone dry. "You could say that," Silas replied. "I got a telegram from the marshal in Santa Fe," she continued, getting straight to the point. "He says the county judge just recused himself from any and all matters concerning Asa Crow. His replacement is a man named Ferris. Crow put him in office." She let the words sink in. "The courthouse isn't just unclean. Boone, it's bought and paid for. Whatever proof you think you have." She glanced at Ellie. "It won't see the light of day in a courtroom around here." The news was a gut punch, the one path to legitimate justice. The very reason Ellie had run was a dead end. The law was a sham, another tool for men like Crow. A profound despair washed over Ellie, so heavy it almost brought her to her knees. If the law wouldn't help, what was left? Sheriff Hollis looked at their weary, soot-stained faces. "Crow's hired on a half-dozen more gunslingers," she said, her voice softening slightly. "He's not being subtle anymore. Watch your backs." With that, she turned and rode away, leaving them alone in the smoky air with the grim new reality of their situation. The weight of it all settled on Ellie. She looked at the blackened earth and felt a rage begin to smolder beneath her guilt. If she ran now, what would happen? Crow would win. He would take this land, Silas's land, just as he had taken the Acomas. He would ruin these good people, Silas and Raoul and little Tommy, because they had dared to offer her a moment of kindness. The guilt she felt was not just for the danger she had brought, but for the injustice she had been running from. Her flight had been about saving herself, but standing here, on this wounded piece of land, she realized it had to be about more than that. It had to be about fighting back. That night, an exhausted silence fell over the house. Raoul had gone to his bunk, and Tommy had cried himself to sleep. Silas sat on the edge of the porch, staring into the darkness, the rifle resting across his knees. The fire had awakened his ghosts. He saw again the battlefield. The smoke that had been thicker than this, choked with the screams of men. He had sworn an oath over his friend David's body that he would never again stand by and let evil prevail through his own inaction. He had tried to build a life of peace, but he saw now that peace wasn't a state of being. It was a territory to be defended, a fortress to be held, and the enemy was at the gate. Ellie came out and sat on the step below him, too tired to speak. They sat that way for a long time, listening to the crickets and the whisper of the wind over the burned field. The shared battle, the smoke and fear and sweat, had forged a new intimacy between them, deeper than words. Finally, she leaned her head sideways, resting it gently against his knee. It was a simple, trusting gesture, an acknowledgement of everything they had just endured together. He didn't stiffen or pull away. He simply let her, his hand resting near, but not on, her shoulder. "The first day I saw you," Ellie said, her voice quiet and raspy, "I asked to hide under your coat. I was just trying to get away." She paused, gathering her thoughts, her voice gaining a new strength. "I'm not hiding anymore, Silas," she whispered to the darkness. "Now, I want to stand beside you and face it." Part 5. The house is locked. The heart leaps. The false peace that followed the fire lasted 3 days. It was a tense, quiet period, the air still hazy with the memory of smoke. They worked to repair the damage. Their movements economical, their conversations clipped and practical. But a new vigilance had settled over the ranch. The rifle was never propped in a corner anymore. It lay across the kitchen table. Raoul's old peacemaker was tucked into his belt. They were no longer homesteaders. They were a garrison of 4, waiting for a siege. The attack came not in the dead of night, as they had expected, but under the brazen, indifferent glare of the midday sun. Ellie was in the kitchen, a fine dusting of flour on her arms, kneading a stubborn batch of dough. The rhythmic work was a comfort, a small piece of normalcy in a world that had tilted off its axis. Tommy sat on the floor nearby, arranging his collection of smooth stones into the shape of a lizard. Raoul was on the porch, his back to the open door, patiently restitching a piece of leather harness. The scrape of his awl a familiar, peaceful sound. Silas was in the barn, his measured hammer blows ringing against a broken axle, the very reason he'd been on that train. There was no warning, no shout, no sound of approaching horses. The back door simply exploded inward, torn from its leather hinges, slamming against the wall with a sound like a thunderclap. The world dissolved into chaos. Vance Cutter filled the doorway, a cruel smirk on his lips. Flanking him were 2 hard-faced men Ellie had never seen before, their eyes cold and empty. The kitchen, which had felt spacious and safe moments before, was suddenly claustrophobic, crowded with menace. "Well now," Cutter said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Looks like a cozy little home you've made here, girl." He took a step inside, his spurs ringing on the wooden floorboards. "Crow's tired of waiting. Give us the book and the girl, and we'll leave the old man and the boy." Raoul was already turning, the leather-working awl held in his hand like a dagger. From the barn, the hammering stopped. Silas knew. "Get out of this house," Ellie said, her voice a reedy thing she barely recognized. She instinctively moved to put herself between the men and Tommy. Cutter laughed. "That's not how this works." His men fanned out. The fight was a sudden, brutal eruption of violence. Raoul lunged, not with the slowness of his age, but with a surprising, wiry strength, driving his awl at the nearest man's arm. The man roared in pain and swatted him away, sending the old man crashing into the table. Flour billowed into the air like a ghostly fog. At the same moment, Silas burst through the front door, a heavy blacksmith's hammer in his hand. He didn't shout or hesitate. He swung the hammer in a low, vicious arc that caught the second man in the leg, buckling him with a wet crunch of bone. It was a close, desperate brawl, a whirlwind of grunts, the thud of fists on flesh, the splintering of a chair as it was thrown aside. Ellie scrambled for the rifle on the table, her fingers closing around the cool wood stock. But before she could bring it to bear, the dynamic of the fight shifted with horrifying speed. The man Raoul had stabbed, his arm bleeding freely, saw his chance. With a snarl, he lunged past the fray and snatched Tommy from the floor. He spun the boy around, clamping a hand over his mouth and pressing the cold, flat blade of a Bowie knife against his small throat. "Enough!" he screamed, his voice raw with pain and fury. Everything stopped. The chaotic motion froze into a horrifying tableau. Silas, who had been grappling with Cutter, stood paralyzed, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Raoul lay on the floor, struggling to breathe. Cutter slowly straightened his vest, a triumphant smile returning to his face. "Now, that's better," Cutter said smoothly, enjoying the absolute power of the moment. "Put the hammer down, Boone, and you, girl, put that rifle down, or my associate here is going to give the boy a little grin from ear to ear." The man holding Tommy tightened his grip, and the boy let out a muffled whimper. The edge of the blade indented the pale skin of his neck. Ellie stood frozen, the heavy rifle in her hands. Her entire world narrowed to the glint of that steel blade and Tommy's terrified, wide eyes. The urge to run, to scream, to simply cease to exist was a physical sickness rising in her throat. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the weapon. "Breathe out slow," a voice whispered in her mind. Silas's voice. "Squeeze. Don't pull." Her terror was a roaring inferno, but in its heart was a single, cold point of stillness. She looked at the man holding Tommy. She saw his eyes, darting nervously between her and Silas. She saw how his injured arm made his grip on the knife unsteady. She saw her target. And then, a sound cracked through the tension, so loud and sharp in the enclosed space that it felt like the sky was splitting open. Boom! Raoul, pushing himself up on one elbow, had fired his old pistol, not at anyone, but straight up into the ceiling. Plaster and dust rained down. For a single, crucial instant, every eye, including the man holding Tommy, flickered upward in shock. It was all the time they needed. In that half-second of distraction, Tommy, with the primal instinct of a cornered animal, bit down hard on the hand covering his mouth and stomped on his captor's foot. The man yelled and his grip loosened. Simultaneously, Ellie's world came back into focus. The shaking in her hand stopped. She breathed out, and the rifle, an extension of her own will, kicked against her bruised shoulder. She didn't aim for the head or the chest. She aimed for the shoulder of the arm holding the knife. The shot was clean. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony, as the knife clattered to the floor. Tommy scrambled away, running for the safety of the porch. The spell was broken. Silas exploded into motion, lunging not at the wounded man, but straight at Cutter. He drove his shoulder into Cutter's midsection, slamming him back against the wall. But as he pressed his attack, the third man, the one with the broken leg, swung his pistol like a club. The heavy steel barrel connected with the back of Silas's head with a sickening thud. Silas's eyes went vacant. His body went limp, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. It was the darkest moment. The protector, the rock, the center of their defense, was gone. A raw, primal scream tore from Ellie's throat. She chambered another round, the mechanical schlick-schlack of the rifle a sound of pure menace. She leveled the barrel at Cutter's chest. For the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. His position had collapsed in seconds. One man was screaming on the floor, clutching a shattered shoulder. The other was crippled, barely able to stand. The boy was gone. And the girl he'd dismissed as a helpless pawn was now pointing a rifle at his heart with an expression that promised nothing but retribution. "Let's go," Cutter snarled at his men. He was a pragmatist. This wasn't worth dying for. He grabbed his wounded man, dragging him toward the door. The other man hobbled after them. They crashed through the front door and scrambled onto their horses. In their frantic escape, one of the horses slammed against the mended front gate, tearing the splintered wood apart and leaving it hanging, broken and defeated. Once again, silence descended upon the kitchen. It was a thick, ringing silence, filled with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and spilled flour. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slicing through the ruined room. Tommy crept back inside, his face streaked with tears and dirt, and ran to Raoul, who gathered him into his arms. But Ellie only saw Silas. She dropped the rifle, the clatter of its fall echoing in the stillness. She ran to his side, her knees skidding on the flour-dusted floorboards. He was frighteningly still, a trickle of dark blood matting his hair and staining the pale wood of the floor beneath his head. That small, dark pool of blood was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. It was the physical manifestation of her deepest fear, the loss of this quiet, steady man who had become her anchor, her shelter. She gently touched the wound, her fingers coming away sticky and red. A sob caught in her throat. but she swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury. Running was a memory. The girl who had jumped from the train was gone, burned away in the prairie fire and shattered in the violence of this room. She looked at the devastation around her, the broken door, the overturned furniture, the blood on the floor. This was the home she had found. This was the family she would protect. Her gaze hardened, her fear crystallizing into a diamond-hard resolve. She would not run. She would stay. She would tend to Silas's wound, clean the rifle, and stand watch. She would hold this ground, and when Silas was back on his feet, she would not just hand him the ledger. She would walk beside him and use it to tear Asa Crow's world down to its foundations. She had found her line in the dirt, and it was here. Part 6. Between two sentences, the law of the jungles and consciences. Time slowed to the rhythm of a shallow breath. In the aftermath of the raid, the world of the ranch shrank to the four walls of Silas's small room. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, wood smoke, and the clean, sharp smell of the herbal poultices Raoul prepared. Ellie kept a constant vigil, moving with a quiet efficiency that belied the frantic terror she had felt during the fight. She bathed the gash on his head, changed his bandages, and spooned thin broth past his lips. The violence had scoured her clean of fear, leaving behind a hard, protective shell of purpose. She spent the long hours watching him, memorizing the stern lines of his face, now softened in unconsciousness. She saw the silver at his temples, the faint scar from the war, the calloused strength in his hands. During the second night, as she sat beside the cot, his hand, which lay still upon the blanket, twitched. Without thinking, she covered it with her own. His fingers, cool and unresponsive at first, eventually curled, a faint but definite pressure around hers. The connection was a silent current in the still room, a promise that the man who had sheltered her was still there. She sat that way until dawn, her hand holding his, a solitary anchor in the quiet dark. He woke on the third day. His eyes fluttered open, hazy with confusion at first, then slowly focused on her face. A long moment passed as he pieced the world back together. His first words were not a question of what had happened, or of his own pain, but a simple, raspy query that held the weight of everything. Still here. A wave of relief so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over Ellie. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slid down her cheek, but she smiled, a watery, genuine smile. Still here, she confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. We're all still here. A week later, Silas was sitting up, his head bandaged and his movements still slow, but the clarity had returned to his eyes. He sat at the repaired kitchen table, a silent testament to the battle that had been fought there. Sheriff Maeve Hollis sat opposite him, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. Ellie and Raoul stood nearby, the four of them forming a council of war. The men Cutter brought with him were drifters, Hollis reported, her tone all business. Paid in whiskey and a few dollars, they're long gone. But Cutter is still in town, and Crow is acting like he owns the place, because, she added grimly, he does. Your warning about the court was plain enough, Silas said, his voice rough. The ledger won't be enough if the judge is in Crow's pocket. It's our word against his, Ellie stated, her newfound resolve hardening her voice. And our word means nothing to men like that. The book is proof, Raoul interjected, his voice a low rumble. But proof is a quiet thing. It needs a human voice to give it life, to make the people listen. Hollis nodded, her gaze steady. That's why I'm here. I've been digging. There was a collapse at one of Crow's silver mines 2 years back. A support timber gave way. He called it a tragedy, said the men were lost. He never paid for a real rescue crew. Said it was too dangerous. I remember that, Silas said. 12 men. One of them wasn't lost, Hollis said, leaning forward. He clawed his way out through a ventilation shaft 3 days later, half dead. His name is Ephraim Cole. Crow had already filed the death certificate and paid his wife a pittance in compensation, with a clause that she couldn't sue. When Cole showed up alive, Crow's men ran him out of town, told him if he ever spoke a word about the faulty timbers, he and his family would disappear for good. "Where is he now?" Ellie asked, her heart beginning to beat faster. "He lives in the bottoms," Hollis replied, her mouth tightening. "The collection of shacks and tents down by the rail yard, the colored folks' camp. He's been there ever since, doing odd jobs, terrified of his own shadow." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. To ask Ephraim Cole to testify was to ask him to risk everything, his life and the lives of his family, on the word of a law that had never protected him. He was a black man in a territory where his rights were barely theoretical, being asked to stand against a rich white man who controlled the courts and the guns. It was an impossible choice. "It's too much to ask of any man," Silas said quietly, the truth of it hanging in the air. "Maybe," Ellie said, her voice cutting through the doubt. "But what's the alternative to let Crow keep burying people alive? One way or another." She looked at Hollis. "I'll go with you." The journey to the bottoms was a descent into another world. They left the wide, dusty main street of Redemption, with its false-fronted buildings and confident swagger, and followed the tracks to a low-lying area of town that most citizens pretended did not exist. Here, the homes were patched together from scrap lumber, canvas, and hope. The air was thick with the smells of coal smoke and communal cooking fires. Children with watchful eyes stopped their play to stare as the two women, one wearing a sheriff's star, the other a face they did not know, rode in. It was a place built on the margins, where survival depended on staying invisible. They found Ephraim Cole behind a small, surprisingly neat shack, splitting firewood. He was a tall man, but he held himself with a permanent stoop, as if the weight of the earth he'd escaped was still on his shoulders. A jagged scar ran down the side of his face, pulling one eye into a constant, mournful squint. When he saw the sheriff's badge, he immediately stiffened, his face closing down into a wary, impenetrable mask. Hollis was direct. "Mr. Cole, my name is Sheriff Hollis. This is Ellie Hart. We need to talk to you about Asa Crow." Fear, stark and immediate, flashed in his eyes. "I got nothing to say about that man. I don't want no trouble." A woman, his wife, appeared in the doorway of the shack, wiping her hands on an apron, her expression just as frightened. "They aren't going to just leave you alone," Ellie said, her voice softer than the sheriff's. She slid down from her horse, taking a step closer. "I know you're afraid. He wants to hurt me, too. He thinks because I'm a young woman and you're a black man that we don't have a voice the world will listen to. He thinks we'll just stay scared in the shadows." She told him her story, not the details of the ledger, but the simple, human truth of it, of being trapped, of being treated like an object, of the violence that had come to the Boone Ranch. She spoke of the fire and of Silas being struck down. "They left you for dead in the dark of that mine because it was easier than doing the right thing," she finished, her voice steady and clear. "He is trying to do the same to me, to all of us. All we have to fight back with is the truth. Your voice, added to the proof I carry, might be enough to make the people listen." Cole looked from Ellie's earnest face to the sheriff's badge, then to his wife, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. The conflict tore at him. He was a man of quiet dignity, but he was also a man who had been taught a brutal lesson about the cost of defiance. "You're asking me to put a rope around my own neck." "I'm asking you to help us take the rope from Crow's hand," Hollis countered, her voice firm but not unkind. "I will offer you protection. My word on it." Before he could answer, the world changed. The wind, which had been gusting all afternoon, suddenly began to howl. The sky to the west turned a sickly, bruised yellow. A low roar grew louder, and a solid wall of dust, hundreds of feet high, was bearing down on them. Sandstorm Hollis yelled, "We have to go now." There was no more time for talk. Ellie and Hollis mounted their horses just as the first wave of grit-laden wind hit them. The sun vanished. The world was reduced to a swirling, blinding chaos of brown. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind shrieked, a physical force that threatened to tear them from their saddles. They couldn't ride. They dismounted, clinging to the reins of their terrified horses. "This way!" Hollis shouted, her voice nearly snatched away by the gale. "Try to keep the tracks to our left." It was a nightmare journey. The sand blasted their exposed skin, stinging like 1,000 tiny needles. It filled their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. Ellie tied a kerchief over her nose and mouth, but it did little to stop the choking dust. The world was a roaring, suffocating void. She lost all sense of direction, relying completely on the sheriff's shouted commands and the pressure of a hand on her arm. At one point, Ellie stumbled, her foot catching on an unseen rock. She went down hard. For a moment, she felt a wave of utter despair, a desire to simply lie there and let the storm bury her. But then a strong hand gripped her arm and hauled her back to her feet. It was Hollis, her face a phantom mask of dust, her eyes grim. "We don't stop," the sheriff yelled over the wind. "We never stop." They supported each other, two solitary figures battling a force of nature that was as blind and destructive as the greed of Usa Crow. They were no longer the law and the fugitive. They were simply two women fighting to survive, bound together by a shared purpose and the elemental struggle against the storm. Hours later, bruised, battered, and covered head to toe in a thick layer of dust, they stumbled into the relative shelter of Silas's ranch. The storm was already beginning to blow itself out, the wind lessening its shriek to a mournful sigh. They had made it back, but they had returned without an answer from Ephraim Cole. Yet, as Ellie leaned against the porch rail, catching her breath and looking back into the receding gloom, she knew the journey had not been for nothing. She had faced down the raw power of the desert and had not broken. She had found an ally in the most unlikely of places. The fear was gone. Whatever came next, she would face it on her feet. Part 7. The sun at high noon in the county court. The county courthouse was not a hall of justice. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The room was long and narrow, built of raw pine that had warped in the heat, and the air was a suffocating blanket of stale sweat, cheap perfume, and dust. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating a haze of floating particles. The only relief came from the rhythmic swish and creak of palm leaf fans wielded by the spectators, a sound like the rasping of 1,000 cicadas. Ellie sat at the plaintiff's table, the worn leather ledger placed squarely before her. It felt as if it weighed 100 pounds. Beside her, Silas sat unnaturally still, his face pale beneath his tan, the bandage on his head a stark white slash against his dark hair. He was present, a silent, unmovable support, but Ellie knew the effort it cost him. Across the room, Asa Crow lounged in his chair, looking unconcerned, almost bored. He was flanked by a lawyer from Santa Fe, a man named Sterling, whose suit was too fine for this dusty room and whose smile was as slick and cold as a wet stone. The jury was a collection of local merchants and ranchers, men whose livelihoods were intricately tied to the railroad and, by extension, to Asa Crow. They shifted uncomfortably on the hard benches, their eyes avoiding Ellie's, darting instead between Crow's confident smirk and the hulking figure of Vance Cutter, who stood pointedly by the main door, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. He wasn't a spectator, he was a threat, displayed for all to see. Sterling began his assault with a condescending air of pity. He painted Ellie as a confused, hysterical young woman, spurned by a benevolent benefactor. He called the ledger a work of fanciful fiction, the diary of a girl who couldn't distinguish reality from melodrama. "We have here," Sterling said, waving a dismissive hand toward the ledger, "nothing more than a book of scribbles. No official seals, no corroborating signatures. It is a document born of ingratitude, presented as evidence by a runaway who has aligned herself with a reclusive and clearly unwell rancher. He glanced pointedly at the bandage on Silas's head. The room murmured. The jury looked relieved. This was an easy story to believe. It required no courage, no difficult choices. "This ledger," Ellie said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself, "is a record of theft. The names, the dates, the amounts, they are all real. And who, my dear girl, can possibly verify that Sterling Purd, the county clerk's office, has no record of these fantastic shipments?" This was the moment. Sheriff Maeve Hollis, who had been standing quietly at the side of the room, stepped forward. "Your Honor, that may not be entirely true." Judge Ferris, a man whose face seemed permanently flushed with whiskey and compromise, looked annoyed. "What is the meaning of this?" "Sheriff, the county clerk is a meticulous man," Hollis said, holding up a thin, leather-bound book of her own. "He keeps a private daily blotter, a record of all transactions, inquiries, and filings that cross his desk, whether they are made official or not. He makes a copy for his own records at the end of each month. I have here the copy for the last 2 years. Sterling's smile faltered. "That is inadmissible. It's personal property." "It's a business ledger, kept on county time," Hollis countered, her voice ringing with authority. "And it contains entries on dates that match Miss Hart's book of Asa Crow making cash deposits to the clerk's personal account. It also notes inquiries made by Mr. Crow into land deeds belonging to the Acoma Pueblo inquiries that were never officially filed. She placed the blotter on the judge's bench. It may not prove the silver was stolen, Your Honor, but it proves a pattern of secret dealings and bribery directly related to the county's own records." A jolt went through the courtroom. The first twist. The jury was no longer looking at Ellie as a fantasist. They were looking at Asa Crow, whose face had finally lost its bored expression and was hardening into a mask of cold fury. Sterling began to bluster, objecting loudly, but the damage was done. Hollis had provided a foundation of official corruption upon which Ellie's claims could now rest. "This is a conspiracy," Sterling shouted, a desperate attempt by a small-town sheriff to make a name for herself. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. He turned his attack back to the ledger. "Even if these payments were made, it proves nothing about any mine. Where is the victim? Where is the man who was harmed by this supposed scheme? He does not exist." As his words echoed in the hot, still air, the large double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a groan. Framed in the doorway, a tall, stooped figure stood silhouetted against the bright glare of the street. He hesitated for a moment, then took a step inside. It was Ephraim Cole. A wave of whispers rippled through the spectators. People knew him. They knew his story, or the rumors of it. He walked with a pronounced limp, his face a roadmap of old pain. The scarred side of his face turned toward the judge's bench. His wife stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped together, her face a portrait of terror and hope. "Your Honor," Ephraim Cole said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "My name is Ephraim Cole. I exist." Sterling's face went slack with shock. Crow shot a venomous look toward Cutter, a look that said, "I thought this was handled." "I was the shift foreman at the North Star mine," Cole continued, walking slowly toward the front of the court. His limp was more pronounced now, each step an effort. "The one Mr. Crow owns, or says he owns. I told him the support timbers in the western tunnel were green wood, too fresh. I told him they wouldn't hold. He told me to send the men in anyway, said the delay would cost him more than the lumber." The room was utterly silent now, save for the frantic swishing of the fans. "The timbers gave way," Cole said, his voice growing stronger, fueled by an injustice that had festered for 2 years, just like I said they would. "It wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice he made. I saw the rock fall. I felt the mountain come down. He stopped and pulled up his sleeve, revealing a forearm crisscrossed with thick, ropey scars. He unbuttoned his collar, showing where the jagged scar on his face disappeared into a mess of damaged tissue on his neck. This is what his choice looks like. He left us all to die in the dark, so he wouldn't lose a day's profit. I was just the one who refused to stay buried. The testimony was devastating. It was not a legal argument. It was a testament written in flesh and bone. It gave a human face to the cold numbers in Ellie's ledger. The jury looked at Cole's scars, then at Asa Crowe, and for the first time, they saw not a benefactor, but a monster. Crowe knew the tide had turned. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to Vance Cutter. Cutter moved. He didn't draw his gun inside the courtroom. Instead, he spun around and fired a single shot into the ceiling of the outside corridor. The explosion was deafening. Panic erupted. The bailiff, a portly man whose main job was to keep spectators from chewing tobacco in court, drew his pistol and ran out into the hall to investigate the shot. It was the distraction they needed. Cutter burst back into the courtroom, his gun now drawn, ignoring the judge, the jury, everyone. He had one target, the ledger on the table. He lunged for it, his face a snarl of desperation. Silas, though still unsteady, reacted with the pure, unthinking instinct of a protector. He threw himself sideways, shoving Ellie's chair back and putting his own body between her and Cutter. It wasn't a fighter's move. It was a shield's. He absorbed the full force of Cutter's charge, the impact driving the air from his lungs with a grunt of pain. The two men crashed to the floor. Cutter tried to bring his gun around to end it, but Hollis was already moving. She brought the butt of her own pistol down hard on Cutter's wrist. Bones crunched, and the gun clattered across the floor. At the same moment, Raoul, who had been standing by the wall, brought a heavy courtroom chair down on Cutter's back, pinning him to the ground. It was over in seconds. Cutter was disarmed and subdued, howling with pain and rage. Silas lay on the floor, dazed, the wound on his head reopened and bleeding sluggishly. Hollis dragged a sputtering Cutter to his feet and slammed him against the wall, snapping handcuffs onto his broken wrist. Judge Ferris, his face the color of ash, finally found his voice. He banged his gavel, a weak, tinny sound in the charged atmosphere. Order, order. But the old order was broken. The room was buzzing, the spectators on their feet, their fear finally replaced by a shared sense of outrage. They had witnessed the truth, and they had witnessed the brutal attempt to silence it. "Asa Crowe," Sheriff Hollis called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and intimidation of a witness." Two deputies, their courage bolstered by the turn of events, moved to flank Crowe, who stood frozen, his empire crumbling around him. The judge, seeing the will of the crowd and the undeniable evidence before him, had no choice but to nod his assent. A warrant was issued to seize the North Star mine pending a full investigation. Outside, the sun was at its zenith, beating down on the dusty street with an impartial, cleansing heat. The chaos of the courtroom had given way to a stunned silence. Ellie stood on the boardwalk, the precious ledger clutched in her hands, watching as Crowe was led away. Silas came to stand beside her, leaning heavily against a porch post. A fresh bandage was wrapped around his head. They stood for a long moment, not speaking, simply breathing in the clean, hot air. Ellie turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. It was an inadequate phrase for what he had done, for the home he had given her, for the life he had saved, for the body he had put between her and a bullet. Silas looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He didn't answer with words. He slowly, deliberately, shrugged out of his long duster coat. He unfolded it and gently draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from the sun, heavy and comforting, smelling of dust and him. But this time, it was not a place to hide. It was a mantle, a public declaration. From now on, he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to shiver in the wind." Part 8. The New Gate. The seasons turned, pulling the land from the scorched, brittle grip of summer into the softer, golden light of autumn. The ranch began to heal. The black scar on the southern pasture, once a raw wound, was slowly being reclaimed by resilient shoots of new grass. The air, which had for so long tasted of dust and smoke, now carried the clean, sharp scent of distant rain and curing hay. The rhythm of life returned, not to what it was before, but to something stronger, tempered by the fire it had endured. The most potent symbol of this renewal was the new gate. Silas, with Raoul's quiet assistance, spent the better part of a week on it. He dug deep post holes, sinking thick, solid timbers of cedar that would not rot or yield. He planed the planks for the gate itself until they were smooth to the touch, fitting them together with a craftsman's precision. There was no wire, no temporary splint. This gate was built to last, hung on heavy, black iron hinges that Silas had forged himself in the heat of his small smithy. The sound of his hammer, which had once been a signal of impending violence, was now the steady, reassuring heartbeat of reconstruction. When it was finally finished, hanging straight and true, Tommy, who had watched the entire process with the solemn intensity of a foreman, produced a length of blue ribbon he'd saved from a candy box. He stood on a crate and, with great ceremony, tied it around the new wooden latch. Raoul, sitting on the porch steps with his pipe, watched the boy and let out a soft, wheezing laugh, his eyes crinkling in his weathered face. It was the most joyful sound Ellie had heard in months. The news from Redemption was a distant echo, with Crow's assets frozen and his network of bribery exposed by the county clerk's blotter. His empire had collapsed. Vance Cutter was sent to a territorial prison. The bought and paid for judge had quietly resigned. Justice, it turned out, was not a single dramatic moment in a courtroom, but a slow, methodical untangling of old knots. Ellie found her own role in that untangling. One afternoon, Sheriff Hollis rode out to the ranch, not with a warning, but with a request. She brought with her a young woman, no older than 16, whose eyes held the same hunted look Ellie remembered seeing in her own reflection. Another coercive contract, another powerful man claiming a girl as his property. The old Ellie would have offered sympathy. The new Ellie offered strength. She sat with the girl in the kitchen, Silas's duster coat hanging on a peg by the door, a silent witness. She didn't just listen to the girl's story. She shared her own. She showed her the ledger, explaining how a record, kept with care, could become a weapon. Fear is their currency, Ellie told her, her voice calm and sure. The truth is ours. By the time Sheriff Hollis left, a plan had been formed. A legal challenge was being prepared, and the young woman's shoulders were a little less slumped. Ellie had ceased to be a survivor. She had become a protector, a partner with the law she had once run from. Silas watched this transformation with a quiet pride that was a new and profound emotion for him. He had spent his life building walls, both literal and emotional, to keep the world out. Now, he found himself wanting to build a world for someone else to live in. The silence that had been his shield for so long now felt like an absence, a space he needed to fill with something other than just action. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table, mending a bridle. The small, unleather-bound notebook he used for ranch accounts lay open. Tucked inside was the small, pressed yellow wildflower. Its color faded, but its form perfectly preserved. He looked at it for a long time, the memory of Ellie picking it, a small, defiant act of hope in the middle of their fear, as vivid as if it were yesterday. Ellie entered the kitchen, carrying a pail of fresh milk. She saw what he was looking at, and a soft smile touched her lips. "I have a new one now," he said, his voice quiet. He gestured to a newer, thicker ledger on the shelf. "For the ranch accounts." He paused, and for the first time, he gave voice to the truth that had been building between them. Unspoken. "Our accounts. He stood and walked to the shelf. Taking down the new book, he opened it to the first page, where he had already begun to log the season's wool yields. He took the small, fragile flower from the old notebook and carefully placed it within the clean pages of the new one. "Some things are worth carrying forward," he said. It was more than a statement about a dried flower. It was a confession, a promise. He was choosing to carry the hope, the tenderness, the connection she had brought into his life, forward into their shared future. He turned to face her, the space between them charged with all the things that had gone unsaid. He had sheltered her, fought for her, and stood as a shield before her. But the final, most important step, he had to take with words. "When I came back from the war," he began, his voice low and rough with the effort of bearing a piece of his soul, "I made a promise to myself to be left alone. I thought peace was an empty field, but the quiet, it's a hungry thing. Ellie, it eats at you." He looked at her, his gray eyes holding an emotion she had never seen there before, a deep, vulnerable certainty. "You filled the quiet. This place, it was just a piece of land I was holding on to. You and Tommy, you made it a home." He took a step closer, his hands finding hers. They were strong, calloused hands, but his touch was gentle. "I'm not just staying because it's my duty. I'm staying because you are the peace I was looking for. I choose to stay. I choose to protect this, to protect us." He hesitated, then said the final, simplest, most difficult word. "I love you, Ellie." Her own heart, which she thought had been permanently scarred by fear, felt as if it had been made new. "And I love you, Silas," she whispered, her voice catching. Their life together was built on a foundation of such moments small, repeated acts of care, spoken truths, and shared work. It was a love that was as solid and real as the new gate that guarded their land. The following Sunday, as the afternoon sun cast long, warm shadows, they stood before that gate. Silas had just finished oiling the new hinges. He swung it open, then closed it. The latch settled into place with a satisfying, solid click. Ellie came and stood beside him, her hand resting on the smooth, sun-warmed wood. She looked out, past the gate, to the open prairie. No longer a place of threat, but a landscape of possibility. She turned her face to the sun, feeling its warmth without a trace of fear. She looked at Silas, at the quiet strength in his face, at the love in his eyes. The memory of her first desperate plea on that cold, wind-swept train car rose in her mind, not as a ghost of terror, but as the first, fragile seed of the life they now shared. "The first day," she said, her voice soft but full of a strength she now owned. "I asked to hide under your coat." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Today, I asked to walk with you through the gate out into the sun. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover this tale.